Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of The New Norm with Selena Hill. I am your host, Selena Hill, and I am super excited to have with us today Areva Martin. She is a civil rights attorney, best-selling author, legal commentator, talk show host, and a Harvard Law School grad who has been a critical voice for social justice. Thank you so much for being here today, Areva.
Oh, my pleasure, Selena.
Like I was telling you offline, a lot of hearts are broken right now in wake of the death of George Floyd, which followed a number of other killings of Black and brown men and women, particularly at the hands of either cops or white vigilantes. And it seems like things are sort of accumulated into a moment, a very heated, tense moment that we're seeing now, particularly in Minneapolis. And I wanted to ask you to sort of chime into what you see going on, the state of Black America, and also the riots as a reaction.
Yeah, Selena, I guess for me, it's almost, I feel like I have post-traumatic stress syndrome. Let me start with that. And I think the whole country is experiencing a level of trauma, the likes of which we've never seen. Now, we've seen cops kill African Americans. We've witnessed that over the last decade, and because of cell phones and videos and cameras, we've been able to see what has been happening for years, but now we get to see it filmed. We get to see it played out in our living rooms and on our phones and across all social media platforms. So the police brutality isn't new, but now it's being filmed. And because it's being filmed, we watch these inhumane and brutal acts, and they are traumatizing. And I have deja vu thinking back to 4, 5, 6 years ago, where I spent hours and hours on TV talking about whether it was Eric Gardner or Michael Brown or Tamir Rice, Trayvon Martin. I mean, those cases, every time I see one of these cases, like George Floyd or Breonna Taylor or Ahmaud Arbery, you can't help but have a flashback to some of those cases that happened 5, 6, 7 years ago. I had the honor and privilege of interviewing on my show Oscar Grant's mother. And remember Oscar Grant on a train in Oakland doing nothing. I mean, like minding his business, and he gets shot by a BART police officer, killed. And the chilling words of his mother were, "Why did they have to shoot him? They didn't have to shoot him." And it was as if that murder, her son, Oscar's murder for his mom, Wanda Johnson, was as real today as it was in 2009 when it actually happened. So when you say the state of Black folk, we're hurting right now. You can't talk to anyone without the subject of these murders coming up, without people expressing their outrage and their pain.
As a civil rights attorney, in your opinion, is it acceptable for a police officer to put their knee on someone's neck? And
No, categorically no, hell no, emphatically no. What we witnessed on that videotape with Mr. Floyd is categorically unacceptable, excessive use of force, a complete denial of his civil rights, of his human rights. When you think about what led up to it, and I think that's so important, because in all of these cases, there's some narrative, there's some backstory, there's something that leads to this deadly interaction with police. And in this case, it's the allegation, and let's be clear, it's just that, it's the allegation, because it hasn't been tried, there's been no court proceeding, but there's an allegation that Mr. Floyd is passing some kind of counterfeit $20 bill or something. So when you think of the minor, the minute, the insubstantial, the inconsequential nature of the alleged crime, it makes the murder and the death of this young man even just more horrifying. To think that something that benign would end up with someone kneeling, and let's be clear, he was kneeling on his neck, cutting off his airwaves, for what appeared to be just, I've heard reports as much as 7, 8, maybe even 9 minutes. And the cavalier nature of those other officers who were standing around listening to this man plead and beg for help. It's just chilling. I stopped watching the video. I can't, in the midst of this pandemic where we've all been in, our homes for 10 weeks, dealing with all kinds of other issues, businesses and the losses that the 100,000 plus people that have lost their lives. It's overwhelming.
Reva, speaking of the police officers, it's been revealed that Derek Chauvin, he was the man who we saw kneeling, he actually had a history of violence. There were a number of complaints. He was the subject of complaints by the City Civilian Review Authority and the Officer of Police Conduct Reviews on 10 different occasions. Meanwhile, the other officer we've seen in the video, who was sort of standing guard, he settled in an excessive force lawsuit out of court for $25,000 in 2017. So my question is, why is it so hard to get ill-equipped officers off the force the first or second time that they commit these offenses?
And that's an excellent question, Zelina. And we see that often in these cases, is that when we start to dig into the background and the history of these officers, quite frequently, there is a history of use of excessive force. There may be a history of civil lawsuits that have been filed. There may even be some disciplinary action that's been taken against these officers, yet they are back on the streets, back, doing the same job that they were doing, and leaving us to ask, are they ever reprimanded? Are they ever removed from the force? Quite frankly, police officers belong to unions, and they have very strong police unions. And those unions make it very difficult to have them removed. If you think about the Eric Gardner case, what's different, one of the major differences in Eric Gardner and what we are seeing in Mr. Floyd's case is it took the officers, it took 5 years for that officer in Eric Gardner to be terminated. There's civil service processes that have to occur. Typically an officer, there's a recommendation for discipline. They get to go before an administrative body. If that body determines that they've engaged in some kind of misconduct and they're terminated, they get to appeal that determination. So it can be a long and very drawn out process to have an officer removed. And some people are asking, even with respect to these Minneapolis officers, if they may have some rights under their union contract with that city that would allow them to be reinstated or to somehow have some administrative process occur before those terminations are final.
Yeah, excellent point. This scenario, it's eerie how similar it is to Eric Gardner's case in Staten Island. I'm also here in New York City, and his final words were, "I can't breathe." And then you see George Floyd saying, "I can't breathe." And Daniel Pantaleo, the officer you were just speaking of, like you said, he was on force for 5 years. Is there a chance that something like this could play out in this new situation with George Floyd as well?
Well, I hope not. And I think the actions of this police chief, he acted swiftly. There was a decision to terminate those officers immediately, unlike in the Eric Gardner case where the officers, there wasn't a clear statement of, by the mayor at that time, by the police chief. We heard more of, let the investigation play out. We see that all the time in these cases, let the investigation play out. And there are some cases where there should be a thorough, well, let me say this. In all cases, there should be an investigation. But in some cases, when we have the receipts, when we have the video, the investigation can be pretty short. So just using the word investigation doesn't mean that a case should be drawn out for 2, 3, 4, 5 years. Some investigations can be handled, and they can be handled very competently in a short period of time, particularly when the facts aren't in dispute. So in this case, Mr. Floyd's case, there is videotape, there are the officers, there are eyewitnesses, there were people standing around. So this notion that it could take years to get to some kind of conclusive outcome of an investigation, I think is just more smoke and mirrors. I think clearly competent investigation can be done pretty quickly because we have the evidence on tape. We have the movie. We saw it with our own eyes. So those officers, they'll have statements. They may say, the officer that was kneeling will probably say he didn't mean to kill Mr. Floyd. They'll probably say he was resisting, all of those things that we've heard played out over and over again. But we know what our eyes saw. We know what those witnesses saw, and we know what the evidence is, the overwhelmingly compelling evidence is in this case that justifies those officers being arrested and charged.
Areva, as we continue to watch these killings, murders, alleged murders, you have as you will, on tape, it kind of feels like it's happening more so, but we know the truth of the matter is it's not. It's just getting filmed now. And I think to myself all the time, what would I do, God forbid, if I'm in that situation? To you, as a civil rights attorney, what legal rights do civilians have? It's one thing to, pull out your phone and film, but some people, they get close to actually getting involved because they want to protect another human right. How would you advise someone if they happen to end up in this circumstance? What is the best thing to do in those circumstances? Well,
definitely pull out your phone, because we know that justice is happening to the extent it is happening because we're getting to witness it on tape. Think about Ahmaud Arbery. If there had not been the release of that videotape, and that videotape going viral, it's doubtful that those 3 men now that have been arrested and charged would have ever been brought to justice, because one of the district attorneys in that case wrote a letter basically exonerating the McMichaels, of the father and the son in that case. So if you are in that kind of encounter with the police, you have an absolute right to film it. So I always advise people, start filming. We saw that with Christian Cooper. He started filming what Amy Cooper was saying to him in Central Park. And as a result of that, we saw how the conversation, happened around that case. So you want to document. And in this era, we all have an ability to document by using our phones. Now, obviously, too, you want to not put yourself in a situation where you are resisting. If you are being arrested by the police, you want to comply. You have every right to ask what you're being stopped for, what you're being detained for, what's the basis of the interaction that you're having with the police. So you don't lose those rights to do so. But police have a lot of rights. They have the right to detain citizens. They have the right to engage with citizens, sometimes beyond what we would even necessarily expect to be their rights. That the law, both state and federal law, give police officers a great deal of latitude. But we have a lot of power as citizens, and that's our ability to capture on video what those interactions with police are. And we have seen time and time again, it's those viral videos that forces some district attorneys to take action when they otherwise wouldn't, that forces police chiefs to fire officers that otherwise might, remain on the force beyond a period in which they should be terminated. So the biggest thing you can do, and whether you're observing it as a bystander or it's happening to you in real time, is to record it.
What would you advise is the proper, legal course of action someone should take? Because again, I'm watching these videos and it feels like it's a matter of time before it can happen to me or someone close to me. And it's almost like you want to be proactive. What is it that needs to happen? Like, do we all need to have lawyers on standby? Like, what is the proper course to happen if you are involved with a police officer and you think it's unfair or police brutality?
Yeah, definitely. If you have an encounter with the police, you definitely need legal representation because it's a difficult process. We see these cases in the news and we automatically think, we saw it on tape, it's a slam dunk case, the civil rights of this person was violated. That's not the reality of these cases, the civil cases in particular. There are tons of immunities that police officers have that shield them from liability. Again, they have a great deal of latitude. Their standards often are subjective standards that are used in terms of what was reasonable for that officer at that time. So these cases can be very difficult to pursue from a civil liability standpoint. So you definitely need a lawyer. But I want to back it up some and talk about what we can do as a community. Clearly, on an individual basis, having a lawyer will help you. But I want to talk about how we get to systemic change. And one lawsuit is not likely to cause an entire police department to change. Some of the things that I think we as a community can do is understand the process, understand how those district attorneys get into office, because they're making the charging decision. It is the district attorney sitting at your local county district attorney's office that is going to ultimately decide whether an officer is charged or not. So one, we need to know that. And when election time rolls around in your county and you're voting for that district attorney, you need to vote. You need to understand who's on that ballot, because that is such a critical decision. Local races for mayors, also very important because mayors select police chiefs, and police chiefs select police officers. So when you ask the question, how are those officers still on the force? It's because the police chief of that local police department allowed them to be on the force. So who is your mayor in your town? Critically important. Who is your district attorney? Critically important, because they are the ones setting the policy and making decisions about how police move about your city, the policies that they follow that allow them to, be on the streets and, engage in the kind of negative, lethal conduct that we're seeing being played out in these cases.
Excellent point. Thank you so much for even chiming in on that point of how we get to systemic change, because like you said, all politics are local, and it really does start with those local elections and making sure that we're involved in our communities to the degree that we know who is in place, because these decisions, they have a trickle down effect, and they affect you one way or another. With these incidences being so taxing and emotionally exhausting for us, like I always have, a question for my organizer friends and my activist friends, and of course you, like as a civil rights attorney, how do you do it? How do you maintain just your sanity? You started off talking about, we've seen this play already. We've seen this playbook years ago with Michael Brown and Eric Gardner, and here it is happening again with George Floyd. And it just feels so heavy on us, but you're actually doing the work. And sometimes I would guess it has to feel like a losing battle, or does it not feel like that? And how do you sustain?
No, that's an excellent question, Zelina. And you do get overwhelmed. I mean, you do get overwhelmed because you feel like, I felt like we were making a lot of progress. If you think back to some of those cases that we just talked about, it was body cams that came out of those. That was a big change in policing, that all police departments now were requiring officers to wear body cams. And the thought being, if you know you're going to be filmed, maybe you're going to act right. That was the thinking, that if you know you're going to end up on a videotape, maybe you're going to think twice before you knock somebody upside the head or pull out a gun or take some action that could be deemed excessive. And so that was progress. And then we heard a lot about community policing, not just showing up when there is a crime, but actually going into urban communities, communities of color, getting to know the residents, getting to know the community leaders, and building bridges so that there would be more trust. So we started to see some things, not perfect, by no means perfect, but progress. And so when I saw the Breonna Taylor case and then Mr. Floyd's case, the first thing I said is, did we really make any progress or not? Was all of that illusory? So that was my first feeling. I was disappointed because I felt like we had made progress. And then I felt like these cases, just pretty much eviscerated all of that progress that we have made. But one thing, when you're involved in civil rights as an activist or an organizer or an attorney or a community leader or a journalist like yourself, this work is never done. And we make 2 steps forward and we may go 10 steps back, but we just have to stay on this grind. We have to stay on this journey because our rights weren't won in one battle. So it's not going to be one case. It's going to be, multiple cases. And it's not going to just be changing the laws that allow for maybe a different way for officers to be treated in these cases, make it easier for them to be prosecuted. It also has to do with the politics. Who's in office? What happens at that Justice Department? Under Eric Holder, there was much more accountability of police departments around this country. He would go in, investigate departments, and make these departments enter into consent decrees where they would have to abide by standards set, federal standards of policing. We get a new president in 2016, we get a new attorney general, Jeff Sessions. He says he thought that was too much oversight for police departments. He pretty much eliminated that department as well as that work that Eric Holder was engaged in. I remember Eric Holder going into Ferguson, Missouri, where Michael Brown was, going into a local restaurant talking to communities. Have we seen the Justice Department on the ground in any of these communities, since the 2016 election? No. So, this whole battle is happening on so many different fronts, and we've got to be, firing on all of these different fronts if we really are going to see systemic change in this country. And if we're ever going to see African Americans treated as citizens and not just criminals and suspects, because that's where we are now. Some officers, when they see an African American, they instantly see a criminal and a suspect. They don't see a citizen. And that is going to take a lot of work. It's going to take work at the local level, but also at the national level. And I'm excited about the next 156 days or 155 days, because we have an opportunity to change the leadership in this country. And that's going to be a huge step in addressing the duality of our criminal justice system.
Yes, and you made so many excellent points there. I actually did want to just backtrack a little bit about progress, because progress has been made. And I think that sometimes when we see all of these incidents happening back to back to back in weeks, it almost feels, you become defeatist. But like you said, years ago, Danny Pantaleo was still on the force for, years. And then we've seen what happened with George Zimmerman. He was basically acquitted. But, I think that there have been a lot of lessons learned, like you said, with the body cameras and the fact that there is more accountability. But to the election, like you're saying, elections matter. And I don't think people always correlate, a big general election with how it affects their everyday lives. So if you could just elaborate on why the 2020 election is so important, especially for communities of color.
Thank you, Zelina, for that question. I'm a vent a little. I was so upset leading up to the 2016 election. I think I went on every podcast that would have me. I talked till I was blue in the face about the importance of the Democrats winning in 2016. Put aside Hillary, you could love her, hate her. The reality is whoever was in that office got to pick the attorney general. And if Black folks cared about criminal justice reform, if they cared about what happened to Michael Brown, if they cared about all of those deaths, then you had to understand the importance that the Attorney General of the United States plays in setting the policies. And I just couldn't get people to make that connection. I had people tell me, well, I don't think I could sit down and have tea with Hillary. Okay, girl, you're not having tea with her. That's not her job. Okay, so I'm over that rant, but that was my rant. So here we are again in 2020, right? Leading up to this very critical election, and we're still hearing people talk about, I'm not excited about Joe Biden. He was the architect of the 1994 crime bill. He just made that gaffe on, the morning show, the breakfast, club show, and yeah, all of that. Okay, I'm gonna give you all of that. I'm not gonna argue with you about any of that. But what people need to realize is the president is one person. It's the people that the president bring into their cabinet that run this country. The attorney general, the secretary of education, the secretary of labor, the secretary of treasury. They are making the policies that impact the everyday lives, particularly for people of color. And those are the jobs that are so critical. Under Mitch McConnell and Donald Trump, they have packed the federal courts with some of the most conservative, and I'm going to even say incompetent judges that will have lifetime tenure on the federal bench. And those are the judges, when you get a drug charge and you're standing before a federal court and they're making decisions about whether you're going to go to life go to jail for life on a cocaine charge, it's going to be one of these judges that's been appointed under Mitch McConnell and Donald Trump. So one thing Republicans do really well, they laser focus. And they held their noses and voted for Donald Trump because they wanted to pack the courts and they wanted to see things change with respect to religious organizations. So I say to Democrats, you don't have to love Joe Biden. And boy, he's imperfect and there's a whole lot not to like about him. But I'm not so concerned about him. I know under Joe Biden, we're going to see more African-American women, more Latino women, more women in general in his cabinet. Then we forgot that there used to be African-Americans other than, Dr. Carson, right, in the White House, in the cabinet positions, in positions of power. So if you care about what happened to Mr. Floyd, if you care about Breonna Taylor, if you care about, criminal justice reform, we need Joe Biden more than ever because we need an attorney general for the United States that is going to work on criminal justice reform in ways that are going to be so critical, this year, next year. And so this election, I think, is the most critical election of our lives. And having someone in all of those positions, we talk about education, Betsy DeVos, a complete disaster. And who are the kids that are suffering under her leadership? Black and brown kids in public schools. So again, don't focus on Joe. Think about who would you love to see as Attorney General? Who would you love to see as, Secretary of Education? Who do you want making decisions about all that money that got spent on, under the CARES Act? Do you want Steve Mnuchin making those decisions? Really?
Oh, absolutely not. And to your point, the Supreme Court. I mean, Donald Trump has already appointed 2 justices. God forbid Ruth Bader, she's 90-something years old.
Holding on by like a thread. She can't even get sick. And she has cancer. I mean, this lady she's got a lot of stuff going on. She's fighting, and she's probably holding on. So yes, excellent point. The next Supreme Court justice hopefully will happen under the next administration and not under this administration. And again, do you want Donald Trump to have 3, possibly 4 picks on the Supreme Court? So there's so many important issues like that I hope people will understand during this 2020 election, that will get them inspired, fired up, motivated. And these deaths, as tragic as they are just another reminder of the lack of leadership at the federal level. And if we want real criminal justice reform, it starts at the top. And we need an attorney general that's fighting for us, and not one that is dismantling the Civil Rights Division and dismantling the work that was done under Eric Holder. And I tell people, okay, forget, if you don't care about any of that, think back to the days where you saw your First Lady, Michelle Obama, and President Obama inviting, African Americans to the White House for parties. Okay, y'all, just think about that. Think about Michelle and Barack back at the White House, and Jay-Z and Beyonce, and just a more diverse administration. We haven't seen any of that under this current administration. So there's so many reasons, I think, that people should be fired up about this election, whether it's you're a parent of a kid and you care about education, you care about criminal justice reform, you own a small business and you didn't get that PPP loan because it went to billion-dollar companies, multi-million-dollar companies. So you care about all of those things. They impact our daily lives.
Absolutely. And like you said,
all of those people.
The energy we're seeing now has to translate in the polls in November. I know the president was just talking about, I think he said mail-in votes would lead to more voter suppression. For the first time, Twitter actually had to fact check him. Is it true? Should we be scared of submitting our votes by mail?
Well, the irony of that, Zelina, is the president votes by mail. The president's press secretary has voted in the last 10 elections by mail. And Republicans historically have been the most prolific voters by mail. And that's what the irony is. And they are working secretly and to build up a robust vote by mail program for this next election. The president is very, very good at creating distractions and creating fear. So that's what he's doing with this whole vote by mail. They have there have been study after study after study that proves that vote by mail does not increase voter fraud. It increases voter participation. And that's what Donald Trump is afraid of, voter participation, because he knows when people vote, when Black and brown people, disenfranchised people vote, he doesn't have a snowball's chance in hell of winning the next election. That's what he's afraid of. And he's trying to suppress our vote rather than encourage more engagement in this democratic process.
Young people too. Areva, I could speak to you forever. You know, there's a lot going on in this country, and we know you have a lot going on in your personal life and your career life. If you can just let us know where we can continue to follow you, support you. I know, again, you are a best-selling author. Let us know about your books as well.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. I love having these conversations with smart women like you. It's always encouraging when someone tells me they don't want to have, you know, they can't vote unless they can have tea with the president. So that's stuck with me, obviously. But no, thank you for the work that you're doing, and you know, raising your voice is such a critical time. But people can find me at Areva Martin on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram. I do a thrice weekly, 3 times a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. I do a Facebook Live show. It's called The Special Report. And Monday, we're going to be tackling these difficult cases of race that's been, you know, the whole issue of the pandemic and what it has revealed about the inequities in our country. We're going to be covering Mr. Floyd's case and talking about what's going on with Christian Cooper in that, case involving the dog and the woman who weaponized, her privilege to call the police on him. And we tackle all of the tough issues that are happening during this pandemic. So, everybody has a role to play, and I'm honored. I'm privileged to be able to play the small role that I get to play to talk about these important issues, to have conversations like these with smart journalists like you.
Thank you. So thank you for that. We didn't even get to Amy Cooper. Someone says it looked like she was trying to lynch the dog and get the man lynched. Did you see how she was dragging him?
I don't own a dog, and I'm a compassionate person, but that did stick out in my mind. And then there's this big Twitter war happening where African Americans felt like liberal whites were more concerned about the killing of the dog than they were about the potential consequences of calling the police on Christian Cooper. One thing I'll say about Mr. Cooper: so much grace, so much humility. Even in the midst of all of this, he has empathy for her. And I don't think he ever thought that, that video that was viewed like 30 million times on one day, that it would have the negative consequences that it had, the deservedly negative consequences that it had on her. So I have so much respect for him on so many different levels, because he was literally kind of coming to her rescue, saying, wait, people, if you want to support me, no death threats towards her, ease up on her. And he wanted her to learn from that experience, from the interviews that I've read that he's given. But I think he wanted people to have a little empathy for her. So again, just so much humility and grace from him. But I
think that's something that Black people actually excel at doing. Humility, grace. It's actually been, I think, something that's part of our resilience. It's that radical love that King preached. It's always, we feel for the oppressor and the enemies, and it's almost the way that it's been key to our own survival. You're trying to educate people, but
we saw with Mother Emanuel, those shootings, we saw those families come out and express their love for the shooter, not their anger, their hatred. And you're right, that it's in our DNA. It's how we survive. It's how we play out the lessons that we were taught from great civil rights icons like Dr. King. And in these cases, we often see even these mothers who have suffered the most severe loss you can imagine, the loss of a child. You rarely hear bitterness. They want justice. They want the criminal justice system to work. They want the person to be held accountable, but it's not vitriolic. It's not,
Mm-hmm.
that kind of hatred that you would think would be completely understandable given the pain that, and the loss that they've suffered. So, we got to keep raising awareness. We got to keep advocating. We've got to keep pushing these systems, and we do it in a way that we do best, and that is with grace and humility. Doesn't mean we can't get tough. Doesn't mean that we can't get in your face. Doesn't mean that we can't be aggressive. It doesn't mean that we can't, be serious about ours. But it does mean that, we just have a different way of pushing, and we just got to keep on pushing at this point.
Yes, we do. Thank you so much, Areva. Again, we appreciate your time.
Stay safe out there. Can't wait to get back to New York. So, I know it's been crazy there, and my heart goes out to New Yorkers who are so resilient, and just all the folks that have lost their lives during COVID-19. The cases that we've talked about, so much pain. But one thing we know as a people that we just survive. We just survive. So,
and we will continue to survive. Absolutely. Thank you again. We appreciate your time today and your work.
All right,
and thank you guys for tuning in to another episode of The New Norm with Selena.